Imagine walking through a bustling American city where every headline screams about a booming stock market and historic lows in unemployment figures. You see the flashing lights of Times Square or the polished glass of Silicon Valley, and yet there is a heavy, invisible fog hanging over every household from Maine to California. The official data suggests that we should be celebrating a golden age of prosperity, but the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index reveals a much darker story, plunging to levels that historically signaled deep national crises. This massive disconnect between the cold, hard numbers of the government and the burning anxiety in the hearts of citizens is what many economists now call a vibe recession, where the macroeconomic data looks great on paper while the lived experience of the average person feels like a slow motion disaster. We have been conditioned to believe that as long as the gross domestic product keeps climbing and the S&P 500 continues its relentless march upward, our personal financial health is somehow guaranteed by the sheer momentum of the system. This is the grand illusion of the modern era because it ignores the reality that wealth is being concentrated at the top while the foundation of the middle class is being eroded by the silent thief of cumulative inflation. When you go to the grocery store or look at your monthly rent statement, the government statistics telling you that inflation is cooling feel like a cruel joke or a deliberate form of psychological gaslighting. People are no longer judging the economy by the complex charts on a Bloomberg terminal, but by the dwindling balance in their checking accounts after paying for the basic necessities of survival in a high-cost world. Why is it that in the wealthiest nation on earth, the majority of the population feels like they are standing on the edge of a jagged cliff, waiting for the slightest breeze to push them over the side? The answer does not lie in a lack of hard work or a failure of individual ambition, but in a systemic shift that has made the cost of the American dream prohibitively expensive for those who follow the old rules of the game. We are witnessing a historic collapse in consumer confidence because the old promises of stability and upward mobility have been replaced by a cycle of perpetual debt and rising anxiety about the future. In this video, we will peel back the layers of this economic facade to understand the psychological mechanisms and mathematical traps that are keeping you awake at night, and more importantly, how you can navigate this treacherous landscape to find true financial security. What is really secretly controlling your wallet, and why does it feel like your hard-earned money evaporates before it even hits your bank account? To find the answer, we must look past the monthly inflation headlines and examine the devastating impact of cumulative inflation, which has acted as a silent thief stealing the purchasing power of the American dollar. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the overall price level has surged by more than 20% since the beginning of 2020, creating a permanent higher floor for the cost of living. Even if the rate of inflation slows down to the 2% target set by the Federal Reserve, the prices do not return to their old levels, which means the average family is essentially paying a massive invisible tax on every loaf of bread and every gallon of gasoline they buy compared to just a few short years ago. The root of this pervasive anxiety is not just the price of groceries, but the sugar-coated mousetrap of the modern credit system that has lured millions into a cycle of high-interest dependency. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York recently reported that total household debt in the United States has climbed to a staggering record of over $17 trillion, with credit card balances alone exceeding $1.1 trillion. This mountain of debt is not just a number on a balance sheet, but a crushing psychological weight, because interest rates on these cards are now hovering at historic highs near 21%. Every month that you carry a balance, you are participating in a reverse lottery where the house always wins, and you are forced to work several hours every week just to pay for the privilege of the debt you have already accumulated in the past. Beyond the physical math of debt, there is a deeper psychological phenomenon occurring known as financial fatigue, where the constant struggle to keep up with rising costs leads to a state of learned helplessness. Behavioral psychologists have noted that when people feel that their effort is no longer tied to their economic progress, they lose the motivation to save and instead fall into the trap of nihilistic spending. This is why we see a rise in luxury spending or expensive dining, even among those who claim to be broke, because the dopamine hit from a small indulgence is the only relief they have from the long-term realization that the American dream of blank home ownership is slipping out of reach. It is a defense mechanism against a system that feels rigged, which only serves to tighten the financial noose over time as the reality of the monthly bills eventually catches up with the temporary high of consumption. The most insidious part of this crisis is the explosion in non-negotiable costs such as housing and insurance, which have become the primary drivers of the modern economic squeeze. While you can choose to skip a vacation or cook at home, you cannot escape the relentless rise in rent, which has outpaced wage growth in almost every major metropolitan area across the country. Furthermore, the cost of home and auto insurance has spiked by double digits due to the increased frequency of climate-related disasters and the rising complexity of modern vehicle repairs. These are not optional expenses but mandatory requirements for participation in modern society, and when these fixed costs consume 50 or 60% of your take-home pay, there is simply no margin left for error or for building a future. This systemic pressure has created a generation of consumers who are technically employed but functionally fragile, living just one car breakdown or medical emergency away from total financial collapse. The traditional safety nets have been stretched thin, and the old advice of just working harder is no longer sufficient when the fundamental mechanics of the economy are working against the average individual. We have entered an era where the rules of the game have changed, and those who do not understand the invisible forces at play will continue to find themselves running faster and faster on a treadmill that is tilted against them. But to escape this trap, you must first understand the specific mathematical levers that are being pulled behind the scenes to keep the gears of the consumer machine turning at your expense. To truly grasp why the American consumer feels so defeated, we must look at the cold, hard mathematics of purchasing power, which acts as the ultimate judge of economic reality. If you take $100 from the year 2020 and compare it to its value in the current marketplace, you will find that it has lost a significant portion of its utility for essential goods. This means that even if your employer gave you a 10% raise over the last few years, you are technically and mathematically poorer than you were before the global inflation surge began. This hidden tax of inflation is the fundamental reason why families feel a sense of dread even when they are working more hours than ever, because the arithmetic of their daily lives simply does not add up to a surplus at the end of the fall month. The most dangerous mathematical force in the modern economy is the explosion of credit card interest rates, which have reached levels that were once considered extreme by historical standards. With total national credit card debt exceeding $1.1 trillion, the average American household is now caught in a web of 21% annual percentage rates, as reported by the Federal Reserve. When you carry a balance of $5,000 at these rates and only make the minimum payment, you are essentially paying thousands of dollars in interest alone over several years without ever touching the principal balance. This is the definition of reverse compound interest, where your future labor is being harvested by financial institutions while you remain stagnant in a state of financial servitude. However, the same mathematical principles that are currently destroying your wealth can be flipped to become the engine of your liberation if you understand the power of positive compounding. The stock market, as measured by the S&P 500, has historically provided an average annual return of approximately 10% over long periods, which allows capital to double roughly every 7 to 10 years. The problem most people face is that they never reach the critical mass required for this compounding to outpace their cost of living because they are too busy servicing high-interest debt. Once you reach a certain threshold of invested capital, the money begins to generate more income than your physical labor ever could, which is the exact moment you achieve escape velocity from the consumer trap. The core math that will change your financial game is the realization that every dollar you save is not just a piece of paper, but a tiny soldier working for your future freedom. If you can eliminate high-interest debt and shift those monthly payments into a low-cost index fund, you are moving from a position of negative growth to exponential expansion. The difference between a person who stays broke and a person who builds wealth is often just a matter of who is on the right side of the interest rate equation. By focusing on the math of scale and efficiency rather than the emotional lure of temporary consumption, you can begin to build a fortress of wealth that is immune to the fluctuations of national consumer sentiment. Understanding these mechanics is the first step toward reclaiming your agency in a world that wants to keep you in a state of perpetual spending. We must stop viewing money through the lens of what it can buy today and start viewing it through the lens of what it can earn tomorrow. This shift from a consumer mindset to an investor mindset is the only logical response to an economy that is designed to drain your resources through inflation and high interest rates. In the next chapter, we will explore how this fundamental change in perspective can transform your entire life from one of quiet desperation to one of strategic power and long-term security. The fundamental difference between the struggling masses and the truly wealthy often comes down to how they define the concept of a successful life and what they consider to be a status symbol. While the modern consumer culture relentlessly encourages you to project an image of prosperity through expensive, depreciating assets like luxury vehicles and designer labels, the strategic mind understands that true wealth is the money you do not spend. This profound shift in perspective requires you to reject the constant social pressure of looking rich in favor of the quiet and invisible power of being wealthy, which is defined by your ability to survive without a paycheck for years rather than just a few days. When you finally realize that every unnecessary luxury item is essentially a gilded shackle that binds you to your desk for another year, you begin to see the world through a much more objective and empowering lens. We must deeply address the concept of opportunity cost, which remains the invisible price you pay for every single decision you make in the marketplace today. Every time you decide to spend $50,000 on a brand new vehicle that loses half its value in just 3 years, you are not just losing $25,000 in physical depreciation, but you are also sacrificing the potential hundreds of thousands of dollars that money could have earned if it were invested in a productive index fund. The strategic thinker views themselves as a psychological time traveler who is either sending valuable resources to their future self or effectively stealing resources from their future self to satisfy a temporary and fleeting craving in the present moment. This realization transforms your relationship with money from one of impulsive emotional reaction to one of deliberate long-term architecture where every cent is evaluated for its future utility and growth potential. Moving from a scarcity mindset to a strategy mindset means recognizing that periods of record low consumer confidence are actually the most fertile grounds for building generational wealth for those who remain disciplined. While the vast majority of the population is paralyzed by fear and is cutting back on their investments during a downturn, the elite players look at market fluctuations as a massive clearance sale on the very future of the American economy. According to long-term data from reputable firms like Vanguard, those who have the courage to stay the course and continue investing during times of high national anxiety often capture the largest gains during the inevitable recovery periods that follow. By decoupling your personal emotional state from the chaotic fluctuations of the news cycle or the political climate, you gain a massive competitive advantage over those who are constantly reacting to the latest social media trends. You might find that making choices that look poor or overly restrictive in the eyes of your neighbors is actually the highest and most sophisticated form of financial intelligence in a high inflation world. Choosing to live in a modest home that fits your needs rather than your ego, or driving an older, reliable car while your income continues to rise, allows you to build a massive surplus that can be deployed when the right opportunities arise. This is not about living a life of miserable deprivation, but about strategically buying back your freedom and your time, which are the only truly non-renewable resources we possess in this lifetime. When you stop caring about the shallow opinions of people who are themselves just one paycheck away from total disaster, you gain a level of psychological liberty that is more valuable than any physical luxury item could ever provide. In an era defined by record low consumer sentiment and rising economic uncertainty, the ultimate luxury is not a high-end watch or a first-class flight, but the absolute peace of mind that comes from knowing you are unshakable regardless of what happens in the global economy. This level of resilience is built through the persistent discipline of delayed gratification and the deep understanding that the economic system is designed to reward those who can think in decades while punishing those who can only think in weeks. By shifting your mindset today, you are effectively building a massive fortress around your family that will protect you from the storms of inflation and the traps of high interest debt that are currently drowning the rest of the country. This internal shift is the necessary precursor to the external actions we will discuss in the next chapter, which will show you how to turn this new perspective into a concrete plan of action. The first step to reclaiming your financial sovereignty is the immediate creation of a survival buffer, known as an emergency fund, which should ideally cover 3 to 6 months of your core living expenses to protect you from the volatility of the modern job market. In the current high-interest environment in the United States, you must look beyond traditional brick-and-mortar banks that offer near zero interest and instead park your cash in a high-yield savings account, often referred to as an HISA, which currently offers significantly higher annual percentage yields because of the Federal Reserve's hawkish stance on interest rates. This fund acts as a psychological firebreak that prevents you from reaching for a high-interest credit card when your car breaks down or an unexpected medical bill arrives, effectively breaking the cycle of new debt before it can even begin. By automating a specific percentage of every paycheck to go directly into this separate account through your payroll provider, you remove the burden of individual willpower and ensure that your safety net grows steadily, regardless of your daily emotional state or the fluctuating news of the national economy. Once you have established a basic level of liquid security, you must launch an aggressive and calculated offensive against your existing high-interest liabilities using a strategy known as the debt avalanche method, which is favored by financial experts for its mathematical efficiency. This approach requires you to list all your debts from the highest interest rate to the lowest, and then direct every extra dollar of your surplus income toward the balance, with the most predatory interest rate while maintaining minimum payments on all other accounts. Unlike the emotional momentum of paying off small balances first, the avalanche method is the mathematically superior way to minimize the total amount of interest you will pay over time, and it accelerates your path to freedom by destroying the most expensive leaks in your financial ship first. You must remain disciplined and ignore the urge to spend the extra cash, as individual debts are cleared, because every time you eliminate a high-interest balance, you effectively give yourself a permanent raise where the money that was previously being siphoned off by banking institutions now stays in your pocket to be used for your own future wealth building. The final and perhaps most transformative step in this practical roadmap is to transition from a defensive posture to an offensive one by automating your long-term investments into broad-based index funds, such as those tracking the S&P 500 or the total stock market. By setting up a recurring contribution through a brokerage account or a tax-advantaged retirement vehicle like a 401k or a Roth IRA, you are engaging in a strategy called dollar cost averaging, which allows you to purchase more shares when the market is low and consumer sentiment is at its most depressed. This systematic approach removes the dangerous temptation to time the market based on fear or greed and ensures that you are consistently building a stake in the most productive corporations in the world that have historically proven their resilience through every major economic crisis. Over the long term, this simple act of automated consistency is what separates the average consumer who is always chasing the next trend from the sophisticated investor who understands that wealth is built through time in the market rather than timing the market. And it provides the necessary fuel for the engine of compound interest to eventually replace your labor income with passive capital gains.